Ancient Iran lived that question more fully than almost any civilization in human history. We are not talking about a footnote. We are not talking about a dusty corner of a museum. We are talking about the largest empire the world had ever seen. We are talking about a system of governance so sophisticated that its echoes still shape the way we organize societies today. We are talking about roads, laws, religions, philosophies, and a way of treating conquered people that the ancient world had simply never encountered before. This is the golden age of ancient Iran, and it begins, like all great stories, not with a king, but with a desert. Imagine the year is 559 BCE. You are standing at the edge of the Iranian plateau, somewhere in what is today the Fars province of southern Iran. The coordinates, roughly, are 30 degrees north, 52 degrees east. The land is vast and unforgiving. The wind carries dust that gets into your teeth, your eyes, your lungs. The sun does not warm here, it presses down. You feel it as weight, not light. There are perhaps 10 million people living across this plateau and its surrounding territories. Most of them are farmers, herders, craftspeople, soldiers. Most of them have never traveled more than 50 kilometers from the place where they were born. Most of them have never heard the name Cyrus. That is about to change. You are wearing rough-spun wool. It is scratchy against your skin in a way that no modern fabric can quite replicate. Your sandals are leather, tied in a way that requires adjustment every few hours, or the sole begins to shift and the strap digs into your ankle. This is not comfort, this is function. Everything in this world is function. You do not eat because food tastes good. You eat because not eating means death. You do not build a shelter because you want privacy. You build it because the night temperature drops so fast and so far that exposure kills within hours. The contrast between that world and the world you probably woke up in this morning is almost incomprehensible. You likely touched a glass screen before you touched anything else. You consumed calories before you had to work for them. You wore clothing that was designed, at least partially, around the concept of personal preference. None of that exists here. Not yet. But what does exist here is something extraordinary.
Purpose. The people of the Iranian plateau in the 6th century BCE were not wandering, they were converging. Two great Iranian tribes, the Medes and the Persians, had been living under the shadow of Assyrian dominance for generations. The Medes had already broken free and built a significant empire of their own. The Persians, under a dynasty called the Achaemenids, were a subordinate people, tributaries, not kings, but subjects of kings. And then came Cyrus. Cyrus II, who history would eventually call Cyrus the Great, was not great in the way that word is usually applied to ancient rulers. He was not simply a conqueror, he was something rarer. He was a conqueror who understood that conquest was the beginning, not the end, that you could take land by force, but you could only keep it through legitimacy. He defeated the Median king Astyages in 550 BCE. Then he turned his attention west. The Lydian king, Croesus, so wealthy that even today we say someone is rich as Croesus, came next. Croesus had consulted the oracle at Delphi before going to war. The oracle told him that if he crossed the Halys River and fought Cyrus, a great empire would fall. Croesus crossed the river. He assumed the oracle meant the Persian Empire. He was wrong. By 546 BCE, Lydia had fallen. By 539 BCE, Babylon itself, the city of the Hanging Gardens, the city of Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful urban center on earth, opened its gates to Cyrus without a siege. Not because the Babylonians lacked walls, they had extraordinary walls. Not because they lacked soldiers, they had armies. They opened their gates because Cyrus had a reputation for mercy that was so unusual in the ancient world that people barely knew what to do with it. He did not burn Babylon. He did not enslave its population. He walked into the city of Marduk and declared himself the legitimate successor to its traditions. He released the peoples that Babylon had enslaved and deported, including the Jewish people, allowing them to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. This act is recorded not just in Persian texts, but in the Hebrew Bible itself. Cyrus is one of the only non-Jewish figures in the entire Hebrew Bible to be called by the name Anointed One, a Messiah. Stand in the dust of that moment. Feel the scale of it. A king in 539 BCE telling enslaved people they can go home. That is not a small act. That is a revolution in the philosophy of power. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in Babylon in 1879 and now housed primarily in the British Museum, records his declarations. He wrote, and this is the substance of it, not a direct quote, that he freed the peoples from their yokes, relieved their weariness, and allowed all the sanctuaries to be reinstituted. He insisted he had brought peace to all the black-headed people, the ancient term for all of humanity.
Some historians debate the extent to which the cylinder represents genuine policy versus royal propaganda. That debate is legitimate and important. But even if it was partially propaganda, the fact that such propaganda existed, the fact that a ruler of this period understood that mercy and cultural respect were worth advertising, tells you everything about the philosophical shift that Cyrus represented. The Golden Age had begun. Now step back and look at the geography of what Cyrus built and what his successors would complete. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, at its peak under Darius I in the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE, stretched from the Indus Valley in modern Pakistan all the way to Thrace in modern-day Bulgaria and Greece, from the borders of India to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Egypt. This was not a borderline case for the title of largest empire in history up to that point. It was decisive. Roughly 40 to 50 million people lived under Persian rule at the height of the Achaemenid period. That represented nearly half of the entire world population at the time. Think about that. Half the human beings alive on Earth were living under one administrative system. And that administrative system was the second extraordinary achievement of this golden age. Darius I, who came to power through a combination of legitimate succession and outright political maneuvering in 522 BCE, was in many ways the architect of what we could call the Persian imperial machine. If Cyrus was the visionary, Darius was the engineer. He understood that an empire of 40 million people across 3 continents could not be held together by military force alone. Force was expensive. Force required soldiers. Soldiers required food and pay. Food and pay required supply lines. Supply lines required roads. And roads, Darius understood, were the veins of an empire. He built them. Thousands of kilometers of roads, the most famous of which was the Royal Road, stretching nearly 2,700 kilometers from Susa in western Iran to Sardis in modern Turkey. A journey that would have taken a merchant 3 months on foot could be completed by a royal messenger in just 7 days, using this road and its network of relay stations where fresh horses waited. The Greek historian Herodotus, who was no great admirer of the Persians, could not help but be impressed. He wrote about the Persian postal system with a kind of reluctant awe, describing how neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness could stop these couriers. That phrase, or some version of it, is today inscribed on the James Farley Post Office in New York City. The United States Postal Service has, without always acknowledging it, been borrowing from the Persians for centuries. The roads were not just for messages. They carried goods from one end of the empire to the other: silk from Central Asia, grain from Egypt, timber from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, spices from India. The empire was not just a political entity, it was an economic ecosystem, and the roads were the circulatory system that kept it alive. Now follow one ordinary life through this extraordinary system.
Her name, let us say, is Ariana. She's not a queen, she's not a general, she's a textile worker in the city of Persepolis, the ceremonial capital that Darius began constructing around 518 BCE. She is perhaps 22 years old. She wakes before dawn in a city that smells of stone dust and lamp oil, the ongoing construction of the royal palace complex providing a constant background noise, the tap of chisels on limestone, the groan of wooden scaffolding, the shouts of foremen coordinating workers. Ariana is, by the standards of her time, not poor. She works in a workshop that produces the fine wool textiles that are used in royal ceremonies and exported along the trade routes. She is paid in rations, silver, wine, grain, fruit, because the Persian administration kept meticulous records of labor and compensation. This is not folklore. These records survive. Thousands of clay tablets discovered at Persepolis, known as the Persepolis fortification tablets, document payments to workers throughout the region, including women who were paid at rates comparable to men in many categories of skilled labor. She does not know she is living in a golden age. Golden ages are only visible in retrospect. What she knows is that this morning she must be at her loom before the sun clears the mountains, that she has a quota to meet, and that the grain she received last week was of slightly lower quality than usual, which means bread that is a little more bitter than she would like. She walks through streets that are, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably ordered. Persepolis is a planned city. Its sewage systems are built into the architecture. Its gates are decorated with carvings of tribute bearers from every corner of the empire: Egyptians, Babylonians, Indians, Lydians, Greeks, Ethiopians, all depicted with equal dignity, each in their own traditional dress, each bringing the gifts of their homeland to the Persian king. This was deliberate. The Persians were making a statement in stone. This empire is not built on the erasure of conquered peoples. It is built on their inclusion. Ariana passes a group of Babylonian merchants arguing loudly near the marketplace, their language incomprehensible to her, but their gestures universal. She passes a Zoroastrian fire temple where the sacred flame has burned without interruption for as long as anyone can remember. She arrives at her workshop as the first light touches the top of the Apadana, the great audience hall that Darius built to receive delegations from across the known world, and she begins to weave. The religion of the fire temple she passed deserves its own moment. Zoroastrianism, the faith founded by the prophet Zarathustra, known in Greek as Zoroaster, is one of the most consequential religious and philosophical systems in human history, and it was born on the Iranian plateau, likely somewhere between 1500 and 1000 BCE, though the exact dates remain contested. The core theological innovation of Zoroastrianism was something that sounds simple now, but was genuinely revolutionary in its time. The universe, Zarathustra taught, is shaped by a cosmic struggle between two forces, truth and light on one side, lie and darkness on the other. This is not a polytheistic free-for-all where gods compete for dominance based on human favoritism. This is a moral architecture. The universe has a direction. History has a purpose. Human beings have a responsibility to choose. This idea that existence is not static but directional, that good and evil are real forces, that human choice matters cosmically, filtered into the three Abrahamic faiths that followed. The concept of heaven and hell, of a final judgment, of an apocalyptic end time, of angels and demons as distinct forces of light and darkness, all of these ideas existed in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in forms that bear a remarkable resemblance to Zoroastrian theology. The Persian captivity of the Jewish people in Babylon and the subsequent Persian liberation of those same people under Cyrus created a centuries-long period of contact between Zoroastrian and Jewish thought. The world you live in today, its dominant moral frameworks, its sense of linear history, its concept of individual moral responsibility, carries the fingerprints of the Iranian plateau. Pause for a moment there. Breathe that in. The administrative genius of the Achaemenid system extended beyond roads and records. Darius divided the empire into 20 administrative units called satrapies, each governed by a satrap, essentially a regional governor. The satraps had significant local autonomy, but they were subject to oversight by royal inspectors who reported directly to the king. These inspectors were called, with a phrase that has a distinctly modern ring to it, the eyes and ears of the king. This was, in essence, an ancient anti-corruption mechanism. The satraps could not simply do as they wished. They were watched, they were audited, their accounts were checked, their military levies were verified. The empire ran on accountability as much as it ran on conquest. Taxes were collected in a standardized way across the empire, though different regions paid different amounts and in different forms. Some satrapies paid in silver, some in grain, some in timber or horses or soldiers. The system was flexible enough to accommodate the economic realities of radically different regions while still generating the revenue that funded roads, palaces, armies, and the vast bureaucratic apparatus that held everything together. The legal system that Darius codified, drawing on Babylonian, Elamite, and Persian legal traditions, was another pillar of the Golden Age. People across the empire had access to legal mechanisms for resolving disputes, for recording property transfers, for establishing contracts. The rule of law, however imperfect, however weighted toward the powerful, existed as a concept. That was not nothing. In much of the ancient world, the rule of law was simply the will of whoever had the largest army in the room. But there is a shadow to this golden light, and the shadow deserves to be seen. The empire was not a democracy. The satraps who governed the regions were not elected. The king ruled by divine mandate, and defiance of the king was defiance of the cosmic order. The labor that built Persepolis was not entirely voluntary. While the Persepolis tablets show paid workers, there was also forced labor, tribute labor, people who had no choice but to work. The equality depicted on the walls of Persepolis, all those tribute bearers in their distinct national dress, was a diplomatic image, not a description of lived equality. The tribute was still tribute. The empire still demanded it under the implicit threat of violence. In the hidden corners of the empire, in the villages beyond the reach of the royal roads, life was harder and less ordered than the grand administrative theory suggested. A farmer in the Indus Valley region probably never saw a Persian official. He paid his grain to a local strongman who passed a portion up the chain. The king in Persepolis was as mythological to him as the stars. And in those same hidden corners, resistance never entirely died. The empire suppressed rebellions in Babylon, in Egypt, in Ionia, along the coast of modern Turkey. The Ionian Revolt of 400 BCE, in which Greek city-states on the Anatolian coast rose against Persian rule, triggered a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the Persian Wars with the Greek city-states, the battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis. Events that Western history remembers as the triumph of democracy over tyranny, though the Persian perspective on those conflicts was rather different. From Persepolis, the Ionian Revolt was a peripheral insurrection, and the Greek city-states were a collection of small, fractious, often piratical coastal communities that needed to be reminded of their obligations. History, as always, is a matter of who is writing it. The Persian Wars slowed the empire, but did not break it. The Golden Age continued. Art, architecture, philosophy, and engineering continued to flourish across the Achaemenid centuries. Persepolis grew into one of the most spectacular architectural complexes in the ancient world, a place where the carved stone almost seems to breathe. Tens of thousands of figures of soldiers, courtiers, animals, and tribute-bearers, rendered with extraordinary skill by craftspeople drawn from across the empire. The palace complex was not just beautiful, it was a communication technology. In a world without mass media, without newspapers, without the ability to broadcast a message, architecture was propaganda. Every stone of Persepolis said the same thing. This empire is permanent. This empire is just. This empire contains multitudes. This empire is yours as much as it is anyone.
And then, in 330 BCE, Alexander of Macedon burned it down. The burning of Persepolis is one of the most debated acts of destruction in ancient history. Ancient sources disagree about whether it was a deliberate strategic decision or a drunken impulse at the end of a banquet. Some sources describe Alexander, surrounded by courtiers and an Athenian courtesan named Thias, who reportedly suggested the act, torching the palace in a moment of theatrical revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Other sources suggest it was calculated, a symbolic killing of the Achaemenid dynasty, a message to any Persian nobility who might consider resistance. Either way, the palace burned. The cedar beams that Darius had brought from Lebanon, the gold that had been hammered onto the walls, the textiles and the records, they burned. The empire that had stretched from India to Greece, that had liberated the Jewish people from Babylon, that had built roads that lasted centuries, that had given the world one of its first administrative superpowers, it ended. But endings are never complete. Alexander himself became, almost involuntarily, a carrier of the Persian legacy. He adopted Persian court customs, he wore Persian dress, he married Persian women. He incorporated Persian nobles into his administration. He was trying to build a successor empire on the foundations of the one he had destroyed, and in doing so, he acknowledged that those foundations were extraordinary. After Alexander, the Seleucid Empire that inherited the eastern portion of his domains governed much of the Iranian plateau. Then came the Parthians, an Iranian people from the northeastern steppes who defeated the Seleucids and built their own empire, deliberately positioning themselves as heirs to the Achaemenid tradition. The Parthians held the Iranian plateau and much of Mesopotamia for nearly 5 centuries, from 247 BCE to 224 CE, fighting off Roman expansion in the west while managing their own vast territories in the east. And then came the Sassanians, another Iranian dynasty, who defeated the last Parthian king in 224 CE and launched what historians called the Second Persian Golden Age. The Sassanid Empire lasted more than 4 centuries until the Islamic conquests of the 7th century CE. During that time, Zoroastrianism reached its fullest institutional development. Persian art, particularly the extraordinary metalwork and silk weaving of the Sasanian period, influenced Byzantine, Islamic, and Central Asian aesthetics for centuries afterward. Sasanian rock reliefs, massive carvings in the cliff faces of the Iranian plateau, depicted kings, priests, and divine investiture with a grandeur that rivaled anything in the ancient world. The city of Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital near modern Baghdad, was for centuries one of the largest cities on earth. Its great arch, the Taq-e, with a span of roughly 37 meters, remained for centuries the largest single-span brick vault in the world. It still partially stands today. You can visit it. You can stand beneath a brick arch built in the 4th or 5th century CE and feel the weight of that ambition pressing down on you from above. The Sasanian period also gave the world a philosophical and theological ferment that would shape the Islamic civilization that followed. When the Arab armies swept across the Sasanian Empire in the 630s and 640s CE, they did not encounter a blank slate. They encountered a civilization with centuries of administrative, artistic, philosophical, and religious tradition. Persian scholars, administrators, artists, and thinkers were absorbed into the emerging Islamic world and became some of its most important contributors.
The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad and representing the height of early Islamic civilization, was in many ways a Persian-Arab synthesis. The great scholars of that era, mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, philosophers, often wrote in Arabic, but thought in Persian intellectual frameworks. The golden thread that began with Cyrus in 559 BCE ran, unbroken in its essential character, through the Islamic Golden Age and into the world that followed. That is what a real Golden Age looks like. Not just brilliance in isolation, but brilliance that seeds the future. Not just achievement in the moment, but ideas, systems, and philosophies that become so embedded in subsequent civilizations that they become invisible, part of the air that later ages breathe without knowing where the oxygen came from. The ruins of Persepolis stand today in Fars province, Iran, at the foot of the Kuh-e-Rahmet mountain. 2.5 million tourists visit them in a good year. The carvings are still extraordinary. The scale is still staggering. Thousands of years of wind and rain and political upheaval have not erased the faces of the tribute bearers, have not collapsed the columns of the Apadana, have not diminished the strange power that emanates from stone laid by hands that understood something profound about the relationship between beauty and legitimacy.
People visit and they feel something. Most of them cannot name what they feel. It is something like recognition. Not personal recognition, none of us were there, but civilizational recognition. The feeling that this place is part of our story too. That the impulse to build something worthy of the human spirit, to organize human communities around something more than brute force, to create systems that acknowledge the dignity of diverse peoples, that impulse is not new, is not Western, is not the product of any single civilization. It is ancient, it is Iranian, it is ours. Ariana, who woke before dawn to weave at her loom in the shadow of the Apadana, did not know she was part of something the world would still be talking about 2,500 years later. She did not know that the administrative tablets recording her rations would one day be excavated by archaeologists and studied by scholars who would use them to argue about the status of women in the ancient world. She did not know that the fire temple she passed each morning worshipped a theology that would echo through 3 of the world's most durable religious traditions. She just wove. She just lived. She just got through the day with a little less than she wanted and a little more than she feared. That is the human story inside the grand story. The empire and the individual, the palace and the workshop, the king whose name history kept and the worker whose name history lost. What we owe to the golden age of ancient Iran is not a debt of gratitude exactly. History does not work in debts. What we owe it is attention, the willingness to look clearly at what was built there, to neither romanticize it into a fairy tale nor reduce it to a footnote, to see the roads and the records and the religious tolerance and the monumental art for what they were, extraordinary human achievements produced by complicated human beings in service of a complicated and sometimes brutal imperial project that nonetheless managed at its best to imagine a world where power and dignity could coexist. That imagination, imperfect, contested, occasionally hypocritical, but real, is what made it golden. Every empire is born in a whisper. The whisper here was a young king from Fars province looking at a world dominated by others and deciding he could build something better. He was right. He was also, like all of us, limited by his time and his humanity. The empire he built would rise and fall and transform and rise again across more than 1,000 years of Iranian history, leaving behind roads and ruins and religions and philosophies and art and ideas that the world has never quite shaken. This research was assembled from archaeological records, primary sources including the Persepolis fortification tablets, the Cyrus cylinder, and the works of Herodotus and other ancient commentators, as well as the scholarship of contemporary historians, including Pierre Briant, whose monumental work on the Achaemenid Empire remains the definitive modern treatment of this period. The bones of this story are old. The telling of it is new.
And somewhere in that gap between the bones and the breath, that is where history lives. The question that remains, the one worth sitting with tonight, is this: which civilization alive today is building something that will still make people feel that strange electric recognition 2,500 years from now? And will we even know we are doing it while we do?